Welcome to today's StudioSense Pastel demonstration. Today's painting is called Rapid Transit. We'll do an underpainting, composition. Well, I want to show movement and activity, planes and distance, and balance in a painting. A lot to cover in this video that's about an hour and a half long. I've speeded up several sections of the video, and you could do so too on your YouTube channel to speed it up too. We're starting off with a monochrome underpainting, and I'm using a vine charcoal and a mid-value gray hard pastel stick for this part of the demonstration. And really the point is twofold. One is to actually get the composition down on the sanded pastel paper, and more importantly, to develop the values of the painting. I want to pull the darks and lights appropriately in this monochrome version. Then what I would do when when I've completed this underpainting, monochrome underpainting, I'll take a isopropyl alcohol wash with an old paintbrush and spread some of that dark gray pastel and vine charcoal in various masses within the various values, and then we'll do a little bit of light spraying on it too with a fixative, and then we'll begin to apply the colored pastels. So at this point, you can see the reference photo. The reference photo on the right is the color version, the actual photo taken, and as many photos are, they're very dark in the shaded areas. We know about that, about how sky and light colors can get washed out. So we need to be aware that when we um, decide how the values will play out in this painting. On the left side of the sanded paper is the grayscale version of that photograph. And we're not going to quite get as close to that grayscale version as in terms of reading it literally, because we know that the photograph, again, as I just said, dark areas are darker than they actually are in reality. So we want to be aware of that. So at this point, I'm going to take some of the isopropyl alcohol and an old paintbrush, because these brushes really get worn down from the sanded paper. I'm using UART um, UART 400 grade sanded paper, which is kind of a rougher version. The roughest are the 300s and the 200s, and the finer UART papers are the higher numbers. I think it might go up to like 800 or so. So when we talk about underpaintings, there are various approaches that you could take. You could take some of the basic values and color of the pastels and apply them, and then spread them out a bit just to fill in some of the tooth of the paper. It helps to have some of that color and that value show through, but also it helps save a little bit of pastel also, since you're spreading some of it out or painting some of it, I guess, in the sandpaper. So that's really what I like to use, why I like to do underpaintings. And you've noticed, if you've seen my other videos, I like to do a lot of acrylic underpaintings, but I do vary that a bit. Sometimes I'll do watercolor, and in this particular case, I'm just going to stick with a monochromatic value study for this particular scene. About this scene, this is from a hike in the North Cascades National Park in northwestern state of Washington. And we came across this river and these rapids fed by glacial melt from the peaks, the higher elevations of these mountains on an afternoon hike back in July. So what I really like about this composition and this photograph is how the river is so wide and active. A lot of movement in this river throughout, really. But I like how it develops and opens up at the bottom, and it's wider at the bottom. And in this particular type of a scene, a vertical format is appropriate. So that's why I've set up this pastel paper in a vertical as opposed to a horizontal format, because I want to capture the sense of distance and height and where this river is coming down from. It's really I guess technically it's really a long waterfall, because it is a sharp decline in the topography off the back of the mountain. We'll learn about plains here. And as you just saw, I applied a very light gray to the distance. There are pines, a mass of pine trees toward the top of this photograph, and behind that is a really cool mountaintop, and with snow on it, and mountain peaks, and all that cool stuff. So those are a lot fader, right? They're a lot lighter, more distant. So in the value study here, I've got that's probably the lightest gray that you could see back there. And I'll keep working the trees, the pines, and get some of the rough shapes of those pines. And also with the rocks, there's a lot of rocks here, a lot of stone boulders from the glacier movement years and years ago. So we won't get too crazy in terms of defining all of them. Definitely not. We want masses here that we want to convey in the rocks. I'm leaving most of the river or the waterfall for a little bit here, but what I want to do is I want to now take a photograph in natural light of what we're doing there and compare that to the value study. And you can see the center, which is the painting, and the left, which is the value. Again, the values in the photograph are a lot darker. But I do need to do is I do need to darken the basically the lower right section of the rock, the lower right section of the river, and a little bit upward toward the middle side of the right side of the river. I think the pines look good. The pines are about as dark value as we would want them. The distance is lighter, and I'd rather leave it lighter because I want to play with a couple of different planes, and use some different distant color in there. And the left needs some darker values, definitely some of the foliage, etc. And of course, we need the darker values in the river. So the next step, what I'll do is I'll get my gray pastel, and I'll start marking out some of the darker shaded areas of the river, and I'll brush that along also with the isopropyl alcohol wash and the paintbrush. Just want to get some of the key points in there. Recognize that the motion of the water really depends on what's below the water, and of course there are rocks below the water and little cliffs, etc. So the water is going to behave in such a way that it envelops over the rocks, it splashes over the rocks, it changes direction based on the configuration of the rocks in this particular river. So here's the brush, and we'll just kind of brush some of this out. And it's sort of like a mess at this point in time, but I think what I'll do is start taking the pastels, and I'm going to really work the left and the right banks, and of course the distance, and we'll pretty much start with the sky and the distance when we start applying the pastels. So here's the sky. The sky I wanted to keep really simple. It was simple in the photograph. There was a large cloud at the back behind the tops of the mountains. We're going to keep that very simple. I don't want to clutter it up because there's a lot going on in this photograph. There's between the different planes of the mountains, and also the water and a lot of the rocks. And we don't want it to be too crowded. So in this particular situation, the sky being kept simple with mostly blue will be probably the most effective way to convey this sky. I like to work typically from the top of the pastel down. So again, as the pastel dust starts to fall down to the painting, you kind of work with it as best you can from the top down to the bottom, at least in the beginning, because then later on toward the end of the painting, or probably in the middle part of doing the painting, you're kind of working all areas of the canvas. So you can see the cloud, roughly the cloud. You can see a little bit of that mountain distance, and a little more blue for a little more contrast of the sky there. So you just don't want your sky to compete with the landscape. You've got to be careful when you look at compositions. Try to keep things simple. Think about large masses. Squint, look for the major values and the colors. and move things around in your landscape. It certainly does not have to be that representative perfectly, right, of the reference photograph. The pines, I like to add deep blue and sometimes purple in the depths and the darkest values of the pine trees when I do pine trees. So I've gotten used to kind of picking out the same colors all the time when I'm doing a group of pines. We'll recognize that we're looking at a bit of a distance here. Blue tends to come in really handy with a blue pastel to convey the atmospheric impact of distance. Certainly in the distance here, we lose a lot of that local color, gets more washed out. But as we get closer to the viewer, the local color will be definitely more prominent. The reference photo now in color, I decided to discard the grayscale reference photo, is not saturated. Sometimes I'll do, actually, most times what I'll do with a photograph, a digital photograph, is I will saturate it using paint.net or Microsoft Paint on my computer and try to pull out, which will pull out colors that you don't see evidently in the basic photograph. So I did that in this particular case. I don't show a saturated version of this photo here, but there are rocks that are almost reddish orange in that collection of smaller rocks on both sides of the river, and you don't see those in this particular reference photo. So on top of the blue, distant kind of feel that I'm building for the evergreens, of course, there's got to be local color of evergreens too. This batch of evergreens that I'm doing now on the left are a little closer. So we're bringing in some of the color. When you look at colors of evergreens, notice you'll see a fair amount of ochre in them, sometimes a little bit of red and orange in the evergreen trees. So you want to kind of bring some of those pastel sticks out. I like that smoky, distant look of blues in the distance. So you'll see me using a little more emphatically some blues to haze out parts of the painting. As for tools that I use to paint, I use a palette knife more frequently than a tortillon. Here's a palette knife I'm using to help do some of the blending, but also notice the up and down movements of the palette knife to represent the ups and downs of the trees. But occasionally, we got to be realizing that there are also cross branches too. So every so often, you want to cut across that and kind of blend it in fashion to represent how the trees are actually laid out. Understand what the trees are that you're doing, understanding what kind of foliage it is, and how the leaves group together, or is it a heavy, thick tree, or are there lots of spaces between the branches and the leaves to take into effect to then apply some light behind those branches. So those are other considerations when doing trees. Pines are among my favorites, and I always start with that deep blue, purple, and a very, very dark green. Notice here I'm bringing some of that orange red color into the pines. These pines are a little closer than the ones on the left side. On the ones on the left side, you see some of the the blue range of pines are the distant ones. The the greener, more ochre and reddish colors are the more close pines to the viewer. Here I'm working up again more of that mountain area. Working on the angles of those peaks, it's nice to use the side of the pastel to get those sharp edges. And there was snow. There was large snow fields in this particular um, part of the mountain, which I would eventually convey here. And I had to be careful when I began putting those snow fields in the mountain because it was conflicting with the color or the value of the clouds, and so I had to modify the clouds a bit, which you'll see later, to show some contrast of value versus the snow. But you can see the kind of distance I'm applying there. I've got some light purples, which are great for distance, mid to light purples, and the blues are really helpful. Um, so in this composition, the angles and the directions of the curves and all, and the we'll call maybe the S curve of the river, all draw the viewer's attention from the front lower portion of the painting up through toward the mountaintops and the sky. In the very distance of that river, there is another waterfall and cascades, which we'll begin to highlight. And when we think about focal point, um, sort of like the back end of that, the very top of the river, where that waterfall is the focal point. However, the design of the composition also entertains the eye and draws the eye into the painting. So a focal point, while important, it was not as important here with the composition, the way it was structured, to just draw the viewer into the river all the way up to the top to the mountains. There you can see the snow that I applied to that particular mountaintop. So notice that I continue to match the value of the pastel with the underpainting grays. And that's the whole point is once the value study and the painting was done monochromatically with dark grays or grays and then washed out to make even lighter grays from that, is those are the values that I want to pick from the colors that I'm going to choose for the painting. It was important to convey some of the strength of the snow in the distance. So you can kind of press harder on the pastel and really push the color in there. As you can see, there's the mountain peaks, which are the slightly darker blue peaks before you see the snowbank. And when you think about what you're looking at, you're probably looking at another row of pine trees way back there that looks like mountain. So you've got those edges of pines um, in that area as well as mountaintop. But at this point, you can see the how close those values are between the cloud and the snow. So we're going to modify that a bit later on. Getting the rocks down now. Getting again, I like a mid-value blue, sometimes a very dark blue, almost a blue black to use for the basic shaded areas of boulders. And there's a lot of rocks in this particular scene. So we want to at least start building color on top of the values as we've defined those values. The left bank has foliage, a lot of green foliage as you can see, but there's also large, long logs, long trees that have fallen that are picking up. Look at the glare that they're picking up in the sunlight. Glad it was a great, nice sunny day there. But the highlights on those branches, on the logs, on the ground, are as well as picking up some of the highlights, some of the reflections and the tips of the rocks. Those are what we want to bring out. We could bring out those lights and we could bring out darks in the rocks, and those two could be designed in a way that will take the viewer again up this river up to the mountaintops, and that's really what we want to do with this painting. Introducing a sort of a mauve color here. This is a unison pastel. It's actually one of my favorites. I find a lot of this color in the in the in the soils around these rivers out west. So I tend to use it often recently with these photographs. I had spent a month touring national parks in the western U.S. and collected about 1,000 reference photographs. The so I want to start bringing in some more contrast. Remember, there's a lot of contrast between the edge of the river, especially the left bank of the river, and the light highlights of the water, the splashing water. So we really want to bring that out. So going in darker around the edges, but providing some variety. I don't want any straight or curved lines of darkness that are solid. We want to break it up because the reality is the values are broken up on the left bank. If you look at the left bank, you see some very dark spots and then some middle value spots. So we want to be careful that we capture that activity. We also want to capture the fact that the water spills over onto the left bank. So we want to pick up some type of moisture or wetness in the in where the rocks are along both edges of the river. As I mentioned, the saturated version of this photograph had yellow ochre type colors and orange colors in the rocks. So, and there's some browns and there's some very light, like beige type colors. So we want to get those in here um, to truly really convey the colors of the landscape. We don't want it to look too gaudy though, so we're not going to pick every color of the spectrum. So we'll have to be a bit mindful of that. So the dark values that I've been applying here, and again, they're very similar to the values that I put down on the monochrome painting, are kind of guiding the basic composition. That lower right rock will be key in this composition. It's the largest rock or boulder in this scene, and by by generating that as a rather dark value and adding about two more dark value rocks on the right side, it kind of guides the eye again up the river. The left bank has a lot of greenery, very brilliant greens. We're going to start with our darker values. They're large, and I actually don't know what these trees are, but they're real bushy trees, and there are two large banks of them, the foreground bank and then the one behind it. And I used again a unison, again a very dark green as the base there for the base of the tree, and then I'll gradually bring in mid value and light value greens, and and we want them to be shaped, as you can see, they're shaped, so they're more rounded, certainly as opposed to the pine trees, and that provides a nice little contrast of of the structure of the trees, the difference between the rounded tops of those green trees and the sharpness of the pines. Again, the looking at the value study, the lightest values are on the outside of that, picking up the sun. We're also picking up a lot of light values in the ground. So I'm right now I'm throwing in a few highlighted type light yellow type colors to guide me. I'll bring in deeper greens eventually and get that value down to where it needs to be on that left bank. As I mentioned before, it was a bit too light compared to the reference photo. We do want to darken that up a bit. So here's another example again of working the kind of like the top to the bottom of the painting. The mid area is beginning to fill out. I'll still jump around a little bit throughout the painting. So often students ask me which part of the painting do you do first or last, or and I tend to just do top down. But you're just going to find yourself going back and forth. It's if you find an area that you think has got the basics of it, of what you want to convey, then you move to another area. So in this particular case, I wanted to get those trees in on the left bank. Once I felt that I got some of the basics of them down, I want to go back on the right side here. And the right side of the painting, there's a lot of rock. There is green back in the distance there, green grasses, but most of the right side are again a series of rocks, and and you could apply slightly lighter value to those distant rocks, being that they are further distant. The bolder, sharper rocks will be in the foreground. As for pastels, I use typically a whole variety of Great American Artworks, Unison, Sennelier. I like new pastels, Rembrandt's, got a little bit of everything. And the the pastel sticks are of various sizes, and my preference is always to use the edge of the pastel as best as I can. I don't want to really use it for drawing. I want to really use it for blocking in values, masses. So as you can see, you're not seeing black in here. You're not seeing black rocks that look like the photograph has black rocks, but you're not seeing that really dark value in here. I would suggest typically what I like to do is if you have a really dark value, it could be a dark purple. You could bring in some dark, even dark red into it, kind of mix a little bit of color in there. As long as the value stays consistent with the value of that part of the mass, that you could bring other colors in, and it really adds some variety and, and and helps enhance the so-called the pure color of pastel. What I find handy is squinting very often at the reference photograph, and squinting at the painting and seeing if I'm consistent there. When you squint at the reference photograph, a lot of the small rocks just disappear. They kind of look like a blur of lights and mid values or so, but really not quite important to convey as the larger shapes in the landscape. And you want to vary the shapes too. I don't want two rocks that are looking very similar in size next to each other or even apart from each other. You want to kind of get that variety of shapes. Variety is, I guess, the spice of life, right? And the variety is really what helps make a painting attractive. Various grays and mauve grays, light purples I found useful for this series of rocks. You could blotch in some colors rather than sketching in the rocks, to help delineate and kind of shape up some of that composition again between the darks and the edge of the water. I like to take that brush again with and a thinner brush, smaller brush this time with the rubbing alcohol to kind of enhance some of those edges and smooth them in. Um, Kind of blend them a bit. Again, let me see where my values are shaking out here, and this wash will help pull that out and help convey that. It will dry up, so it'll dry up almost to about where it was before, but I do find this little test pretty handy in seeing, okay, where am I with this particular um, landscape? So again, I'm really emphasizing the dark edges again to bring out the highlights in the water that we'll eventually get to. But notice there's now we got a little more color in the lower right section with some of those mauve ochre colors. There were some browns in the rocks. So and that kind of adds a little more balance and harmony to the painting because it pulls in some of the color that you see some of the in the distance with the pines on the right side and the pine trees on the right with some of that reddish color. So we've got some of the reddish color in the distance. We've got some also on the pines on the left side, and we have some of them in the rocks also. So by balancing out, taking a color in your landscape and showing it up elsewhere, help apply and balance it around various parts of the parts of the canvas. Also, are very effective techniques which you want to do. So soon I'm going to get to the water. Got to get to that water soon because that's the exciting part of it. And that's really where we want to show a lot of that movement and excitement of this particular rapids. Darkening with the alcohol also helps shape the edges of the rocks or the boulders. You'll notice that some of them are shaped in various ways and rounded out. And so you want little parts that are shaded darker value than others, and then you want to get into the crevices of the rocks and get started to sketch in some of those with a very dark pastel, very sharp pastel, like a pastel pencil come in handy there. Here I'm putting the mid value of the blue of the water. Just get some of those, again, remember where we put those, that grayscale down. Those were the darker spots of the representing the grayscale of the river. So we'll want to get the appropriate value, blue in this case, over those areas. I'll typically go back and forth with contrasting at this stage because the river is so contrasty between the dark and the light areas and the areas catching the sun and the splashing and all that that I wanted to get those lights and darks in here. So the darker values of the river and the lightest values of the river are being done. And go be loose with your hand in terms of strokes. Look how I kind of scribbled that in there for the highlights of the rushing water coming down on the hill. So we want to pull that up because we want to be um, rough with our strokes when we're doing something that's conveying motion. It just tends to be not only is it fun, but it does more accurately capture the activity of this particular scene. So take a look at photographs of waterfalls, of rivers, and just study how the water flows based on obstacles that the water, such as rocks, that the water comes across and how it shapes the direction of the water. There's a lot of detail in water too, and we'll convey some of that in here. Some of the like ripples within a wave, and some of the splashing over the edges of rocks and the edge of the bank. We'll want to kind of pick up some of that activity also. So my favorite are very light blue, bluish white colors, and those are Mount Vision pastels. But they have nice large pastels and they have hard edges, so they're very good for doing sharp points, etc. And so they work really well with highlights. And I use Mount Vision here. I've got this very light blue pastel, almost a white kind of color that I tend to use on the highlighted areas. We'll want to bring in some real color though. We want to bring in some more warmth. It's almost a bit too white, so we have to think about, are we bringing in like an orange type glow to this painting? And if we do, where would that be showing? It's not going to show in all the highlights, again, depending on the direction of the water and any shadows and reflections, etc. But some of it will, and some of it will show some color. Back there at the upper middle area, there's another waterfall, so I kind of threw in a few white highlights there. And I also helped shape out the rocks on the lower right side by lightening up the water around it to give those that bank more shape. Notice the lighter value water there up against the darker rocks. Again, that's part of that contrasty look we want to kind of convey, to keep focus on the water. Just your just eyes go right toward the roughness of the rapids here in this scene from the North Cascades National Park. This large rock here again is somewhat of a focal point. It really catches your eye early on as you begin to look at the scene. So we're going to work on that one a bit further. But going back to the shrubs on the left side, conveying some of the darker shaded areas, and that's another deep green, not too dark, because there is a fair amount of light hitting that side of the bank. But being that it's local color and it's reasonably close, I want to bring up some nice green yellows in this particular part of the painting. You know, your yellow disappears as you go further in the distance, and it goes away totally. So you lose that. That's why green, when you look at green in the distance, it's more of a bluish color because the yellow of the blue, which makes the green, goes away, and you have more blue than anything else. So that's where you'll have a fair amount of yellow green in the foreground here. It'll be stronger the closer it is to the viewer than in the far distance there. But we want to build up that left bank. I found the left bank really interesting. There's just a lot going on there with those logs that are lying down and with the reflections from the rocks, and again that green foliage, and which provided a nice color contrast with the distant faded blues. And you want to just create some suggestion of debris on the left bank. I don't want to be drawing all the little pieces of sticks and little logs, etc. So we kind of want to be simple with what we're doing. Again, that squinting helps keep that discipline of keeping a lot of the detail out of the picture. So there's the log that I placed in there. So the pastels I use, again, I'll repeat this as Mount Vision, Unison, Rembrandt, New Pastel, Cinelaire, Great American Artworks. I use UART 400 grade paper, and which is great because you could wet it uh, with the alcohol wash. You could paint it with acrylic and do the pastels over that. So it's really great, wonderful, versatile type of a paper to use. So now you can see the mid values of the water, which are really almost the darkest values of the water. You'll see I'll be adding a little bit darker value to the dark parts of the rushing water a bit later, but that's now in place in the painting. And then you can see some of the sharp contrast with the rocks. and it's starting to the painting itself is starting to highlight that those rapids even better as we keep working back and forth here. For the darker parts of the river, I'll use deeper blues, some aquas. These are glacial waters. They're very clean, and a lot of deep blues and um, even deep greens in some of the glacial lakes that you'll see out here in the Northwest. Just trying to build some more variety in the shades at the values of the on the left bank there. There's some darker brown soils and darker orange colors, so I'll bring some of those in. And again, with the rocks, I'll take some slightly different colored pastels that are more representative of the different colors of the pebbles and little small stones. There's that mauve color again. And you can kind of bring some of that into the shaded areas too behind the rocks. So now we've got three rocks that are kind of beginning to emerge here. Of course, the larger one, the lower right, and then there's one up slightly to its right with that lighter top, and then there's one further in the distance. This is a deep blue pastel I also use frequently, like a hard edge, and it comes in handy. The shaded areas formed up. You look at the rocks, think about that you get a lot of rounded rocks here, but you'll have some sharper edges and pointy rocks. Again, we want to have that variety in here too. Some of them pick up some highlights from the sun, some reflection come get reflections from the sun, and so lots of little spots of light here and there. So notice so you can see this good view of the plains in this particular painting. We talked about plains, and when I like to look at the plains, I like to look at the the tree lines that we see, the foreground foliage tree line with the round trees with their more rounded tops, the pine tree line. Then there's a secondary pine tree line, which is really a part of the mountain also, and then the mountain itself and the cloud. All those layers, and also they somewhat contrast with the direction of the water, um, which is kind of like going in an opposite direction of part of those plains, and and then the lumpiness of the rocks. So the composition provides a great variety of shapes and directional movement. So just to kind of observe that, and as you're certainly as you're composing paintings. Again, when I mentioned that orange that are in pine trees, I like to bring in an orange pastel pencil, and that helps capture the orange, but also there's some more light back there that's emanating from the distance. And I want to get some of that orange to wrap around the edges of those trees in the back, again, to make it a little more shaded. When I mentioned about water moving over items, there are rocks in the water, and I'm not doing them right now, but I will be putting in some more spots, dark brown colored type brownish gray spots in the water that represent edges of rocks that are submerged below the surface. But here I'll bring in a little more of that deeper blue and aqua deeper value into the darker areas of the deep water that's rushing over these rocks. So I keep working the patterns in the water, the opposing lines here, the contrasts. Um, I actually use the reference photo a little less actively at this point. So I'm kind of being just more creative with my thinking here in terms of how I want to convey the activity of the water. It'll be important to show some overlap of the water on these rocks. The rocks currently kind of look like they're separated out from the water, that they're not touching the water. So we want to get some semblance of moisture on the rocks. That could be accomplished with a lighter gray or a mid-value gray on the edge of the rocks to show that they're kind of wet in certain areas. But for now, we'll kind of keep working some of the rippled movements in the water. This is also an aqua. This is a very hard pastel, which is kind of like a light blue slash like an aqua color that I found handy for this particular scene. Don't forget the splashes. Some of that light color there conveys some water lifting up and rolling over. Little splash down there at the bottom of that rock there. We'll also bring in some water off onto the left bank. The painting itself is not a whole great variety of color in here. I find that, and by the way, here's the darker spots that I'm adding into the water. So that also creates some variety, but also it helps explain why some of the water is going the way it is. So we want to kind of get some of those in there. But the colors, there's greens and browns and ochres and purples, but there's not a whole lot. There's no reds. There's no real orange in here, or bright orange or yellows. It's just a rather subdued selection of colors. I think the limited palette just tends to be more effective oftentimes. So this palette is not too crazy. It's got a lot of browns and deep blues, and as I mentioned, some of that like burnt orange color. Outside of that, the green foliage is really the standout in terms of the difference. You could probably do pretty well even if the foliage weren't a green, but if it were some type of a purplish blue, maybe reflecting an overcast day or something like that, that might have still been effective. And pinks maybe would have worked there too. So not a whole lot. I try to suggest to my students that we try to keep the palettes somewhat limited. Don't want it too gaudy. We don't want every color in the rainbow in that particular painting. So think about that. Again, the value is the most important part, along with the composition and the structure of the composition. Um, Itself, with the composition, you don't want objects that are going to take your vision away from the focal point or the direction that you want the viewer to look at through the painting. You want a painting that engrosses the viewer, that they stay in the painting and observes it. They could go around the painting and go back and forth on it, and that's cool. That's great. Um, you don't want a composition that gets an artist to look outside the painting and not look at it much at all. Like if, for example, if you had a cow in the painting and it was looking at the pointing, looking at the outside of the canvas rather than into the canvas, and you're going to look on the outside of the canvas too, and you're not going to be looking at the painting. So there are ways to direct the vision of the viewer that you want to think about in terms of the placement of the masses in the painting, the placement of the trees and the mountains and the rocks, and you want them to guide your view through the painting. So really, composition is really important, and value is really important, and color is secondary to all this. Even though we like the pure color of pastels. A little more work with the palette knife. That palette knife also helps sharpen some of the points of the water and the overflow of the water. The tortillon I would use occasionally, and they do pick up some of the color, so you might lose some of the color, the pastel. I also like the soft tools that come with pan pastels. Those are really neat for blending, but also for overlaying a little bit of a misty look to a painting. For example, I recently did a painting where there was a foggy portion of the landscape. So I took a soft tool, which is like a sponge on a stick, small sponge on a stick, and used the like a light blue pan pastel color, and just just draped that over the pastel surface of the painting that I had done, and it created very effectively a foggy kind of airy kind of an atmosphere that I wanted to convey. That worked out quite well. Again, taking highlights again. I really like the idea of light colored highlights, picking up spots of sun dappled across the rocks and the water surface here. So there are rocks at the top right bank also. There's some green back there. That was just a portion of the painting that I had not paid much attention to, so I began filling that up there on the upper right for that pine tree line. And again, shaping up again some of the major rocks, but not all the rocks there. When I do a painting, when I'm done for the day, I'll photograph it and I'll look at it on a computer, I'll look at it on my phone, and I'll take notes so that next time I go back and work on the painting, I'll know what I'm going to do. I've got a work plan, an action plan to enhance the painting in some fashion to finish up spots. So that's what I would normally do with this. So this painting I did during the course of a week. Um, and again, each time I finished it, I photographed it, looked at it, took notes, went back, worked on it some more. And so a lot of these movements that I'm doing here, a lot of these applications are based on notes that I had taken on the particular painting. Um, Again, adding some variety, adding a little more detail to the distant pine trees there. The rocks on the right look a little rough still, so we're going to want to soften some of those rocks, smooth them out a bit, and either a tortillon or a palette knife would work there. The soft tools are kind of larger, They're probably too big for that, although I could probably use the point of the soft tools. So look up pan pastel soft tools. They really can come in handy, especially for conveying some fogginess and for some blending. I find them useful also to put in skies, like a blue sky or whatever. And the pan pastels have all kinds of colors, and you can do that easily rather than using pastel sticks. A little more of that orange, and again, I saw some of that blue in there too. The blue and orange are nice contrasting hues, so that looks kind of interesting and adds interest. Got to cut in some of the edges of the trees and the foliage on the left side of the bank, so we want to break that in so it's not like a too rounded area, a little bumpy and rough. We want to kind of get that identified properly. So that's where this pastel palette knife will come into play. So we're almost an hour into this demonstration, and and at this point, the painting itself is, when you think of when are you done with a painting, right? It tells a story. It kind of conveys the basics of what I wanted to convey. It does need some work in terms of edges and softening some areas. Probably could use some more highlights and adjustments. One adjustment you'll see that I'll make is the very top of the river is a curve downward, and water is flat. So we're gonna enhance that to make it more of a waterfall back there. In this case, I'm changing the value slightly of the clouds so that they don't conflict with the same value of the of the uh, of the snow fields on the mountain. So I brought in a little bit more of a pinkish hue for the clouds to kind of change that a bit. And I brought in a little more blue into the snow fields in those mountaintops. Snow is another fun item to paint. We know that kind of reflects the colors of the environment that it's in. So there's lots of blues in snow, and you get pinks depending on you get oranges in snow depending on the time of the day and the lighting. You get shaded snow that could be even a purple, blue. It's really a lot of fun to do snow, actually. Don't use white too much for snow. The trees also, what you want to do when you want to get appropriate sharpness of trees and the points of trees is you need to make sure that your background behind those trees is done, right? You want to make sure that either the sky's done or in this case, the mountains or the sky in this particular situation is done so that now I could put some points on those evergreen trees. That kind of a little more detail you need, but you need to kind of do that so we really know what those are, and that helps explain it. I think on the right side they're pretty good already, so I'll make sharpen up a little bit of it, a little bit, show some variety, some darker points, and there's some lighter points in there, lighter orange points. Again, keep thinking about variety. You don't want replication, you don't want repetition in these paintings. You want them to be different type of structures. So here I'm applying some more of the distant hazy blue color to the pines. It provides a nice contrast of color, contrast of hue in that distance where you got that smoky look far out through as you're perceiving through the atmosphere. Again, a little bit of orange, kind of like a burnt orange pastel pencil, picking up some of the orange in the pines and pulling in some of the warmth in that distance around the pines. Often, when we talk about compositions, we talk about unequal unequal quantity or measure of masses, spaces, color values, and where they're placed. And when we're doing a landscape, again, we have a reference photo which is telling us a certain story, and we want to generally in this particular painting, we're pretty consistent with the reference photo, but we want to have a variety of shapes and placement of different masses. We don't want equality in here. So as they vary, it just adds to the artistic quality of the painting. And in this particular painting, we've got that sense of recession where the background, the furthest distance is really looks like a true distance. It's such a more of a muted, blued out, hazed out type of color that it really helps build and emphasize the main lines here in this landscape. So when we talk about balance in a landscape, as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm now I've been working the entire canvas back and forth to various areas. And when I talk about balance, for example, let's think about that for a moment. It could be a large boulder in this particular example. Oh, by the way, that's the boulder that I put at the top of the river there, which helped reduce the angle of the distant water. And as you can see there, the flattening of the top of the river, water will lie flat. And I wanted to have a rock up there as a on the upper right, which also kind of is balanced with the rock just on the other side of the river, down a bit on the left. And then just notice where the dark parts of the rocks are. If you kind of squint, you could see then on the right, upper kind of mid upper right area, you've got a series of rocks, and there's a small waterfall there. You've got the larger rocks cascading, if you will, down on the right, and then you've got the smaller set of rocks off on the left. And the impact that has is it gets the eye to kind of go back and forth and work your way up to the top of the river where there is a waterfall. The waterfall is very hard to see in the photograph. It's actually easier to see in the photograph, and I didn't really put a whole lot of emphasis in the painting. I just wanted to have that contrasty point at the top of the river where the lightness of that very light whitish blue color contrasts nicely with the pines on either side, and also frankly with the mid value, that mid value sort of mauve pinkish color, light purple color that you see further in the distance. And it's not very clear what that is when you look straight up at the top of the river. Is that another clump of trees? Is it just part of the mountain behind it? You could leave some of your stuff toward the to the interpretation of the viewer, and some of it is just not as important to define in the painting. As well as if you have the values and you've got the atmospheric effects, and so we really have a lot of variety in here. Some of which could be left to the viewer to interpret what's behind that particular rock, or what's going on with the light behind the pine trees, for example. Some of the refining that I've done here on this large rock, the large rock was a little problematic because it was conflicting with the water. The lightness of the water, some of the highlights in the water were confused with some of the highlights at the top of the rock. So eventually, in the final version of this painting, I would actually slightly darken the top of that large rock on the lower right so that it would be more distinguished and a little more contrasty with the highlights in the water. One thing about doing mountains, if you're into the business of painting mountains in your landscape, recognize that the mountains there's two perspectives. One is just the flatness of the mountains, right? So they go up toward the sky, right? There's a large triangle or whatever or variable shaped type mountains in the distance. But don't forget that the mountain also comes toward you. So we need to think about how to convey the portion of the mountain that's branching toward the viewer, toward the artist, as opposed to the portions of the mountain that are further in the distance and kind of flat plane against the sky. So, and certainly ways to do that is if you look at mountains, and if you could study some of my paintings on the website, where I've done several of the Grand Teton Mountains, you'll see that there's a you've got the distant mountain, which is a kind of a gray, light blue type color, but as you get closer, you could see some of the greenery, but it's a very bluish, gray blue type greenery as you come closer, let's say as hills protruded from that mountain toward the viewer. So a lot more of that local color, but not quite local because the mountain is still distant. But that'll give you that dimension so that you could see that there's a mountain that's multidimensional rather than just flat two-dimensional structure on the horizon. Here's the orange, good old orange pencil again. This really came in handy, but I wanted to bring some more of that warmth in here, and also the orange is providing a nice contrast with the blues in that distance. One of the classic textbooks on landscape painting is called Composition of Outdoor Painting by Edgar A. Payne, Payne. I highly recommend that book. He goes over, Edgar goes over so many different potential compositions in the painting, and he takes all the famous artists of the past, like Corot and um, gosh, there's so many of them from like European artists, Constable, Turner, and their landscapes, and he simply sketches out what the painting is. Very small little squares on a page in his book, but he tells you what's good about them and what's done right about them, and there's various names to the various type of compositions, such as the steelyard, where you'll have, say, a large tree on the right in a canvas and a smaller tree opposite, maybe further back on the left. So definitely recommended book. A lot of examples and a lot of lessons about what you should not be doing in a painting. Um, and one is, for example, how in this particular painting, I decided not to really put much of a sky into. We didn't want that to conflict too much. The the plains of the pine trees and the mountains are really simple. When you squint at them, there's not a whole lot of detail in there, just kind of basic values and color. You've got more detail in the rocks, and that's fine. That's providing variety to the distance, simplicity. The the highlights in the river that I'm doing now, you could see a lot of Z and S patterns. That is going to also help guide the viewer's eye up along the river, just as I mentioned before, with the variety of how the rocks and boulders are placed to draw that viewer's attention way up toward the top of the river. So, if I did have clouds in this painting, if it were, let's say, if it were more of a horizontal landscape with fields and trees and a sky that was, well, let's say maybe a third of the painting, looking at the horizontal height of the painting, that you have a great opportunity to design your composition with cloud shadows. So think about it when you look at a reference photo, and you can move trees around. You could, if you get the right composition, you could shift some of those elements of the landscape around, and you could take the clouds. Let's say you have clouds in the painting, and you could create composition with shadows on the ground, which are just a lot of fun. That's a lot of fun to do. So when you think about a painting and what's the focus, right? If you've got a really interesting sky, a stormy sky, then in that particular painting, I would like that painting to be mostly sky. So if it were a horizontal landscape, Maybe two-thirds of the canvas would be a sky, or if it was vertical, similarly two-thirds of it and a little bit of ground. Um, Again, what are you trying to emphasize in the painting? What is it that struck your attention? And then think about what in that composition would be appropriate to rearrange or remove from the reference photo or the view that you're seeing if you're a plein air painter to make it a more effective, balanced painting. Here again, taking a mid to darker value blue, somewhat of a blue aqua to build a little more of those contrasts. I try to shy away from grays very much. I do have a number of neutral pastels. In fact, I think sometimes my palette is too much neutral pastels, so I've been trying to kick up the color over the last few years. But I try to avoid grays. I would almost rather create the gray by working the complement of the particular color to create a gray, or simply get some. I find blues as well as purple, like almost a gray. You can have somewhat of a gray purple type pastel to neutralize certain colors. One of the techniques I like to use, you can see a little bit of here, is I like to bring in some vibrant deep blue in shaded rock areas. I found that that was almost by default when I would do a painting using an acrylic underpainting. I tend to use deep blues, ultramarine blues for shaded areas and for the dark sides of boulders and rocks using ultramarine acrylic. And sometimes it shows through. You can see some of those on my paintings of my paintings that show that underpainting through, and it just really adds a bit of a nice kick to the color. I put a little darker shade blue at the top of the river on the left, as you can see. Again, we have some shaded areas up there I don't want to forget. So I don't want it to be a really sharp, light contrast against the sky up there because it will look like the river is just laid down on top of a bunch of rocks. We've got to start working a little more, and this is some of what I'm doing here is a little more blending in of the edges of the water to the rocks. And that's where more of a subdued, light color, um, subdued light blue, for example, or some slight gray blue, kind of a lighter value, but not too light, would be handy to drape across some of those stones and some of the dirt that you see, certainly, especially on the left side of the painting. So again, I step back and I'll step back, I'll look at this painting, I'll photograph it, I'll come back the next day and look at it. But I've got to ask my question, am I done yet? Is this done yet? Or just going to keep on tapping colors onto this canvas for another several days or so? And you know, often we hear that artists make a mistake by overworking their painting. That there's typically, if you're working on a painting and something really hits you and you say, wow, that's really good, that's really interesting, I would really encourage you to stop, or at least stop that part of the painting. Look at a portion of a painting and say, hey, that's really cool. Don't even touch it later on. Just leave it the way it is. Because there is something about that you've created as an altered state of nature that's really interesting and artistic and creative. So at some point you stop, right? At some point you say, okay, I'm done. This is good enough. You don't want to forget that there's going to be certain technical characteristics that you need to be aware of. It could be technical drawing, for example, something that's if it's really formal, maybe it's an edge of a building or a window, for example. Is it accurate? Is it technically accurate? So you've got some drawing issues to to get into. There may be a color in there that's a bit maybe too gaudy. And you got to think about that. Well, is that kind of right, or should I really tone that down? So you could think of changes that way also. But at some point, you got to stop. And I think I just had a lot of fun continuing to work on this painting, especially with the rocks. But I did end up stopping it at some point. But the painting, it should definitely tell the story that you wanted it to tell. It should really stand out, and it should be, as we'll say again, technically technically correct is um, pretty key. When I think about um, doing a painting, I try to set up some style rules. I always like to show strength of color and brilliance of color and movement in my paintings. So this definitely has movement with the river. I don't want to be, I don't want it to be a replica of a scene. This is probably, as I mentioned before, a, a painting that is very close to the composition in the reference photo. But the true difference is the amount of color and of course the brightness and and leaving off that dark photographic black kind of shadowy areas that photos tend to provide. And the waves themselves, I'm not, other than the darker portions of the waves of the river that are coming off of rocks, I'm not replicating the waves and the ripples to the T there as the photograph is. I'm kind of designing how I want it to be to kind of drape again that or guide that viewer's eyes up along the river. So, the other thing is you don't want to look overworked, right? Um, and when you look at a painting, you 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 think about, well, I want part of it to be blurred. I don't want it to be all really clear and sharp. I want to. I don't want everything to be well defined through the whole canvas landscape because that's just not how it really looks in reality. Um, so you don't see any real defined branches on the pine trees in the distance. You really don't see much at all other than the masses of the mountains in the background. You do see, in terms of detail, some of the reflections on the rocks, some of the individual rocks, and some of the ripples in the water. So that's where you have more detail up front and strength up front, and then softness in the distance. I like to play with atmospherics and lighting here. And what I liked about this scene in particular on the lighting side was how the light came down along from the mountainside down into the river and along the river down through the Cascades toward the viewer. So I thought that was kind of fun. Notice the bottom of the river, by the way. It's not halfway at the halfway point of the lower edge of the painting. As you can see, it's about two-thirds from the left toward the right, about two-thirds of the distance of the bottom of the vertical bottom of the block of sanded paper. So again, so you want unequals. You talk about we talk about the thirds. So those help. The golden rule, which you might have read about, or if you haven't, go look that one up. Um, and that adds to certainly variety and pleasantness in viewing a painting. And the other rule is try to keep things simple. I mean, a simple composition with suggestive detail can be very effective, and you can have various complex nuances, um, such as certain atmospheric effects, lighting, and water reflections, etc. The other thing is the angle of view, and some of these books will tell you that some of the landscape workbooks will discuss that. Is if you look at a scene and you want to convey a painting of that scene, think about what angle you want to take in terms of the perspective that you want to convey. For example, I could be crouching down and looking at this river, this cascade, and looking up, and it could be taller than me. It could be really like it's falling right in front of me. So I could have crouched down and taken a photograph. I think I might have done that actually in this painting. Um, or you could take a perspective of you're up on the hill on the other side, or 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 elevated above it, and and then there will be differences there in terms of how you'll convey that composition. So it doesn't have to be exactly the way you're going to photograph it, and you can practice. I would really recommend sketching out several, not several, maybe two or three different versions of a particular landscape, moving items around, but also thinking about looking at it from a different perspective, looking at it from a higher perspective or from a lower perspective or behind or whatever, and just sketch that and erase and sketch, change the lines and whatever looks pleasing, then take that to your sanded paper and start um, sketching out the composition. Now, when you think about what jurors are going to look for, so because I like to, when I start a painting, I like to think about, I want to make this painting a best in show painting. I want to do my best here. So, and also enjoy certainly doing the painting. You can see I'm still adding highlights and details bit to that log and to that area there with that, and blending them up with the palette knife here. But when you think about what are some of the key criteria in drawing, design, execution, and expression in a painting, first of all, you need to have the fundamentals of drawing intact. You need to how to draw pretty much. So practice, 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 right? Um, then what are some of the design elements of the painting? What are the lines? Where are the lines? What colors? What values? What shapes? What's the texture? Texture could be thickness, bold strokes of the pastel, or more of a muted dotted. You could kind of do cross hatching in pastels, for example. So those are sort of like some of the texture concepts. A lot of well-known artists had much more powerful, stronger texture in the foreground of their paintings, and a lot more blended softness in the distance, and that tends to be very effective. By the way, I have a piece of vine charcoal here that I'm kind of blending in some of the rounded shaded areas of the rocks some more. Again, help to distinguish them from each other to a certain extent. Um, and then when you think of design principles of a painting, how you convey balance, right? Putting those rocks on either side of the river, um, and the balance of the reflective light bouncing back and forth and taking you up to the top of the river. So that's sort of like a balance emphasis, sort of like a focal point, or what we really want to focus on there, showing that movement, showing proper proportions. That's always a key point, certainly when you think about technical aspects of drawing. I could have a painting, for example, of rocks, right? And you don't know if those rocks are huge boulders or pebbles. So if you had something that told you the proportion of those rocks, let's say it's a bird, the seagull sitting on a beach near those rocks, then you'll know how big those rocks are, right? So it's interesting that you could look at a painting and you can't really tell unless there's certain features of that painting that told you really what's that proportion of the items that you're looking at. Here I had a variety of boulders, large boulders and small rocks, and it kind of gets you a general sense that these items are all in perspective. That from the angle and the perspective of the painting, the mountains in the back, I thought this played pretty well, and things seem to be proportionally accurate. There's patterns in here. There's a rhythm to the river. Those are important points, and variety in the painting. So you want to look for some of those criterion in a painting. Um, the other is the execution and how does the artist handle the medium. These are juror notes, by the way, from various shows where you know the if you submit paintings to any of the contests online, for example, and or in live art presentations, the juror will bring out or mention what are the certain features of this painting that caught my attention or that makes it a winner. And I've collected all these comments from various shows, so I'm just throwing some of these two at you right now. How well are you handling the medium? That's a key point too. Again, between pastels and watercolors and oil paints, they could be handled very differently, and you need different skills and practice to be able to handle them effectively. I think the emotional expression is important. Really, what evokes an emotional response in a painting when you look at it says, "Wow, that's really interesting. That's cool. And look at that. Look at the movement of the water here." So I think that's an important component or criterion for good art. You want to have an impact on your painting. You want to produce a feeling. It suggests a certain point of view. And I think if you skillfully combine composition, color, technique, subject matter, uh, and you could create a sense of individuality on that. We think about artists that you could tell a painting is from a certain artist by just looking at this painting. And think about when you do your painting, when you do your art, what individuality are you bringing out in the types of paintings that you do. Like I do mostly all landscape paintings, and land stewardship and environmentalism and all that stuff and hiking are important to me. And the style of the painting too. Are you a realist? Are you an impressionist? Do you really kick up the color, or do you do different colors? Or do you do mostly analogous color paintings? And all kinds of stuff to help define who you are as an artist and what your style is. So as I mentioned, when I record these videos, um, and this particular original video was about 2.5 hours long, and I speeded up these areas, this part of the painting activity. You could kind of slow it down and look at it, and listen to me speak very slowly, I guess, to see more particulars. And I do apologize. Sometimes my hand gets way too much in the way of what I'm doing here. But again, by pulling together some of the darker and the lighter contrasts in here, I'm creating more of a bouncing light. And if you can see the large boulders again, the three large boulders on the right, the one in the foreground, the one up to the right of it, and the one right above that one, above the second one, they all have a pretty light top to them. They're picking up most of the sunlight there, but they also help draw your vision up the river. And the one that I built or emphasized on the left, with a little bit of a lighter color, lighter value, also takes your vision up to that point and across to the water. And just you kind of keep on going. You keep looking at this painting and seeing where it takes you. There's a little more overlap of the river onto the left bank. See some of the ripples, some of the large surges of water are covering up some of those rocks. And I brought a little more moisture down into the lower right section by a little bit lighter values to show that some of the water does seep along those rocks on the right. Softening some of the edges with a palette knife, which is my preference. Blending works really well with the soft tools, as I mentioned with pan pastel. If you did want a blended hazy type area, that actually comes in pretty handy. Put to scope over some light blue haze to a distance. Comes in pretty handily there. I have a dark pastel, small dark pastel. It's just emphasizing some of the shaded areas there. Yeah, put a little more darkness in the background because I wanted that to contrast with the top of the water there, the top of the river. So again, it's a little more of a deep red orange look there. Again, these are just very minor tweaks, highlights throughout the painting. You can see some of that splashing on the left side of the water up against the rocks. A little bit of splashing down at the bottom on the lower right near that large boulder. I like this dark blue pastel pencil. It's my smallest pastel pencil because I use it so often. But it does provide a very nice um, deep shade of color. Another feature of the landscape painting to think about is the imbalance of lights and darks. So yeah, I'm going to squint at this painting as I look at it now, and there's mostly lights. I'd say the certainly the water has a lot of light to it. I'd say in general the rocks are lighter than they are darker. There's more light to the rocks. The land or the bank on the left and the shrubs, most of those are light. The darks are literally the pine trees and probably the beginning of the mountains there, the first level of mountains, and a little bit of the area where the snow is in the mountains. So I think there's a lot of light in here, and I feel that there's a fair amount of imbalance. Maybe if you want to look at in this particular case, I might say that's two-thirds light and one-third dark. Again, working with thirds is good. It's a good thing. It's a pleasant look from the feeling of perceiving a painting. So if you have two-thirds light, one-third dark, or the opposite, two-thirds dark, one-third light, again that adds that's some of that variety that you want in a painting. Reference photos could have all kinds of distractions in them, and I would just really recommend that you limit the composition to the essentials. What is the main point you want to convey? In this case, it's really the waterfalls, the cascades, and everything else is supporting that painting. Again, the rocks are kind of interesting and they kind of grab attention, but it's really the river that does the trick here in terms of we'll call it the focal point. It doesn't have to be a specific point, but if I were to pick where is a focal point in this painting, I'm kind of torn between the very top of the river or the large boulder on the right. In either case, even if both of them are considered focal points, they really work with the composition and the curve of the river in attracting the viewer's attention up through the cascades. When we think about um, composition and focal points, we need to make sure that the main attraction of the painting is not placed too near the edge of the canvas. That could cause abruptness and lead the viewer to kind of glance out of the painting. More aqua pencil. Don't use that pencil too often. The waters in the Cascades, North Cascades National Park, are very blue green. A lot of that pure glacial melt that you're seeing. So it's amazing how clean the water is and how vibrant the colors are. Another point in compositions is lines play such an important role in the composition of a landscape painting. And in this example, the river is sort of like the S line, we'll call it, but you need contrasting lines to it. So some of the contrasting lines versus the river are the angles of the right and left bank pointing down toward the S, if you will. It's not quite an S actually. It's probably it might be a backwards S if I look at the shape of the river and the highlights that I baked into this. But you have those angles going in opposite directions. um, Other thing is if you look at the rocks, there's some flatness in the rocks, some horizontal, roughly horizontal lines, especially of the top reflected portions of the rocks, perpendicular to the direction of the river. So you want that variety too. If you had a landscape of all trees, you would want something horizontal to offset the verticalness of those trees. It could be a log falling on the ground, and that's usually the best example of balancing out a bunch of vertical trees. If you had a lot of horizontals, like fields, long fields, and all that, and the horizon, you're going to want something vertical to help contrast and offset that part of the composition. So think about that too. And that's all. It's all part of the unity of a painting, the placement of objects, the direction that those objects convey in the particular landscape. This was a little bit of a white type of a color. I threw in some of that. I also have like a white with sparkles in it that I've sometimes used. I don't think I used it in this particular painting. Again, there's that little orange pencil, a little bit of a lighter yellowish orange type color, and bringing in some more of that variety. Again, there's a lot of depth in those trees and the tree lines, so you want to convey some of that with some of the changes in the values and the colors and some of the lighting that you want to convey behind it. Regarding the shadows, the shadowed areas, just make sure that you have the shadows right based on the position of the light source. Again, the light coming from the top of the painting, so your shadows are all sort of like on the lower right, in the darker areas where the rocks are. So you want to make sure of that. So just making some final touches here. I like some of that sunlight glow in the distance that I built in there. Um, this product, it's reasonably a detailed painting. It shows movement in balance. This painting shows variety, and several landscape planes with the mountains, the clouds, the row of pines, et cetera, et cetera. So um, that's pretty much it. Just tapping a few final modifications. So I welcome you to come back and visit um, this video and slow it down, speed it up if you want. Kind of try to focus in on really some of those changes and adjustments that have been made. A lot of iterations going back and forth during the painting, and I hope you've picked up some tips of the trade. One last blending with the palette knife in the distance. Again, kick up the color and the reality of that reference photo that's very dark and gray on the right. So hope you enjoyed it. You can reach me, email, website, and come follow me on Instagram at Bob Palmerton Art. Thank you very much for visiting. Enjoy painting.